Ettore Majorana, you sit up in the dark, because the name sounds like a ghost from your physics class. He belonged to Fermi's group in Rome, and then, one night on March 25th, 1938, he boarded a ferry and simply vanished. The official file is spare. A short note, a cancelled meeting, no body. That empty space becomes a field of stories. Picture the dock, the salt air, a coat snagged on a rail, a letter left on a table. Friends wrote he was brilliant and troubled. The papers he left are heavy with equations that quietly changed particle theory. One idea associated with him even carries his name. To physicists, those pages are rigorous thought. To everyone else, they look like a code someone almost solved. Historians offer steady answers. He may have staged a disappearance to escape politics, or he may have taken his own life, or he may have slipped away to live in obscurity. Those readings match documents and witness notes. They respect evidence and avoid leaps. Then there are the marginal pages that fans point to. Small notebooks filled with grids, numbers, and shorthand, notes about particles that mirror themselves. A scientist explains that the phrase means a particle could be its own antiparticle. A storyteller hears scaffolding, a lattice under reality, an invitation to think in terms of discrete blocks rather than a smooth flow. The mind that built modern physics left a blank where answers should be. That gap is the lever that moves ordinary history into speculation. You can accept the simple account and sleep. Or you can hold those coded pages and imagine a universe that can be written down, edited, or rerun. Before the chapter continues, ask yourself which kind of evidence would change your mind, and what you would do if a single sealed note claimed to show a pattern no one had seen before. You read the notebooks under a single lamp, and you notice something else. Patterns repeat in margins. Sequences of numbers show up in different pages, but never explained. Some lines look like ordinary derivations. Others look like shorthand that could hide another meaning. Real physicists say this is common. Brilliant minds invent private notations when they chase a problem late at night. That is the ordinary truth. Yet a small group of readers ran the pages through modern tools. They scanned, they digitized, they checked for repetition and regularity. They found statistical quirks, not enough to prove anything. Enough to make a good argument for curiosity. One researcher told a science magazine that odd structure alone is not proof. It is a reason to look closer, not a verdict. The official investigations closed with sensible notes. Files labeled missing. Witness testimony that slips. A few uncatalogued letters. Archivists say documentation gaps are the reason legends start. Conspiracy storytellers say those same gaps are proof that something was taken away. The difference is method. Historians want corroboration. Myth makers prefer narrative coherence. So why does this case matter to the simulation idea? Because it offers a plausible bridge. Here is a brilliant mind. Here are unusual notes. Here is a disappearance that never resolved. Humans love patterns and causal threads. We knit them into stories that feel bigger than their parts. If you prefer the cautious path, the files teach humility about certainty. If you prefer the darker path, they feel like a whisper from a system you cannot touch. Either way, you are left with the same question. What would count as proof if a scientist actually traced the code beneath reality and then vanished with the only copy? Percy Fawcett. You step off a narrow boat and the air presses like a blanket. The river smells of wet earth and insects. A survey notebook sits open on a crate, and a compass needle trembles in the dusk. He had been mapping places no one in the city believed existed. In 1925, he walked into the Amazon with a party and never came back. Official records show letters, careful field notes, and routes traced in ink. The journals talk about plazas, earthen mounds, and geometric plazas that did not match the old colonial reports. Archaeologists for decades dismissed some sketches as misreadings of erosion or chance alignments. Then, new digs began to reveal that parts of the forest once held dense, organized settlements. That much is now supported by soil studies and radiocarbon dates. What makes the story dangerous to simple explanations is a motif that runs through several maps. Repeating grids, parallel straight lines cut through river curves. Oddly placed angles where organic growth should rule. Specialists warn about pattern seeking. Humans see shapes in noise, and explorers make sense from partial sight. A few independent analysts digitized the old sketches and compared them to modern satellite scans. They found regularities that surprised them, but did not prove design. Those regularities are the kind of thing a storyteller uses as a hinge. Take an ordinary legend and hang a strange map on it, and the legend walks out of the book and into your life. So you stand at the river and hold a page that suggests geometry, where there should be chaos. Do you accept that the patterns are human work from centuries ago, or do you let your mind travel a step farther and imagine an ordered grid hidden beneath the rainforest, like a layer of code waiting to be read? You stand over a rubbed corner of the map where ink has faded to almost nothing. The sketch shows a plaza of rectangles cut into a floodplain. The locals' notes mention earthen foundations and paved strips. Modern expeditions have found post holes and terraces dated by charcoal and pottery, and those dates place major occupation centuries before contact. That confirms he was not wandering in fantasy. Satellite scans add a new truth. When analysts run light wavelengths over the area and look beneath the canopy with radar, straight edges appear where the eye sees only trees. The lines are faint and interrupted by millennia of growth, yet they line up in surprising ways. Geographers call for caution, soils shift, rivers change course. People reshape their land and then abandon it. That is the ordinary work of history. Some independent analysts pushed further. They overlaid the explorers' sketches on modern scans and found repeating angles and parallelism that statistical models flagged as unlikely to be random. The signal is weak, but present. Archaeologists respond that statistical quirks can emerge from selective sampling and from the human habit of drawing straight lines when memory fails. Method matters here more than drama. What turns method into myth is the disappearance. The planner who stitched those maps vanished and took the only detailed route book with him. Without that book, a neat explanation evaporates. Suddenly, the map seems like a cipher. A tidy set of numbers becomes a code in the popular imagination. You close the page and feel the tree line press in. Somewhere under the green, there may be a geometry that belonged to people long ago, or there may be nothing more than human pattern finding. Either way, one artifact remains that refuses calm explanation, and it sits now in an archive, waiting for a reader bold enough to decode it. Nikola Tesla. You stand in a narrow hotel room under a single lamp, and the papers on the table smell faintly of ink and dust. He died there on January 7th, 1943. The official cause reads coronary thrombosis. The story in the newspapers is respectful and short. Here are the facts that matter. He invented the polyphase alternating current system that powers cities. He patented coils and transformers and remote control devices. He lectured about frequencies and waves and the hidden harmonies in nature. His patents and public demonstrations are part of the record. After he died, officials moved quickly. The Office of Alien Property cataloged dozens of boxes. Some papers were sent to museums, others remain described in brief files and not shown to the public. That custody is documented in government records. That is real and verifiable. Where the legend begins is at the edge of those records. Enthusiasts point to the seized bundles, and to a handful of personal notes that read like sketches and thought experiments. They point to late comments, where he mentions harnessing waves at scale, and to interviews where he uses language about the universe as vibration. Scientists read those lines and see metaphors and grand thinking. They also see no credible experiment that demonstrates a programmable substrate to reality. Still, the gap between what was inventor grade and what was archived has weight. A missing notebook can feel enormous. A redacted page feels like a lock on a door. People will imagine code where only shorthand exists. Now picture a single sealed trunk in an archive with a tag that reads Private Papers, and a page count that does not match public inventories. There is a key lost in an office folder. The box sits in a vault. That image is simple. It will not let you stop thinking about what might be written on the pages inside. You open the government inventory page, and the entry does not match the rumor. The list names technical drawings, correspondence, and patent copies. It does not mention a sealed notebook that witnesses later described. Archivists say inventories are error-prone, and that during wartime bureaucracies misfiled boxes. That is mundane. It is also enough to make a story. Engineers point to the papers that are public. There are schematics, notes on alternating current, sketches for high-frequency transformers, and experiments with resonance. Those documents are technical and useful. They do not contain code for reality. That is the plain reading. Then, there are the private notes that people still whisper about. They are anecdotal and fragmentary. In them, the inventor writes about tuning the Earth to a frequency and about a machine that responds like a living instrument. Scholars read those lines as metaphor. Historians remind listeners that visionary language often reads strangely out of context. Journalists and hobby researchers took a different route. They traced chains of custody and found a gap between a hotel clerk's inventory and the items turned over to the archive. They found a notation in a retired clerk's memo about a small trunk with a paper tag that read, "Personal effects." The trunk is unaccounted for. That missing box becomes the hinge for all the stronger claims. So you have three things: verified inventions that change the world, a handful of evocative private lines that could be poetic or prescient, and an archival gap that invites imagination. Which would convince you: a reproducible experiment, a clear notebook, or a public demonstration that cannot be dismissed? The answer will shape how you read every later disappearance. Nikolai Vavilov. You walk into a cool stone room, and the air smells faintly of earth and paper. Shelves hold labeled envelopes and bundles of dried seeds. He traveled the world gathering those packets like a librarian of living things. His notebooks map centers of diversity in precise lists and sketches. Here are the facts you can check. He created one of the largest seed collections and wrote about how crops carry the memory of places and climates. He argued that to save humanity, we must understand the patterns of diversity. He clashed with a rival whose politics favored quick fixes over careful science. In 1940, he was arrested. He died in a prison hospital in 1943. Soviet archives confirmed the charges and the harsh conditions that followed. Scientists read his notebooks as proto-genetics and careful fieldwork. Historians document a grim story of ideology crushing expertise. That is the measurable record. Then there are the metaphors that become rumors. Vavilov wrote lists of varieties and mapped them with line after line. To a storyteller, those lists can look like code. To a technologist, they can sound like a database of life. That is not evidence of simulation. It is a human way of storing information about the world. What changes skepticism into a story is a small inventory note missing from the archive. A clerk wrote of a leather folio with margin markings that did not match catalog numbers. The folio is not in the stacks. If you like concrete proof, you will want lab samples, reproductions, or verification from multiple teams. If you like stories, you will imagine that a folio contains a pattern simple enough to be a key. Which will you prefer when you think of seeds as code rather than as biology? You trace a margin where the ink smudged, as if someone turned a page too fast. The collection catalog lists thousands of packets and species names. field reports describe routes in Russia, and boxes carried on trains. Those are solid. Scholars rely on them, and they rebuild crops from those seeds to this day. Then there are the silences. Prison records show interrogations. Letters that praised him in private went missing from public files. Political trials produce official paperwork and court language, but they also produce blanks where human choices were made. That emptiness is not mystery by itself. It is a bureaucratic fact. Some readers cross the line from facts to story. They point to a single margin note that an assistant made and then crossed out. They point to a leather folio that an old inventory mentions and then does not list. Archivists say misfiling and wartime confusion. Historians emphasize context and primary evidence. Scientists repeat that you cannot turn lists of seeds into a theory about reality without experiments. Still, imagine holding a folio with a list that is not names but patterns. Imagine charts of variation that read like a map of possible changes. For a moment you see life as coded possibilities rather than as chance and selection. That way of seeing is powerful. It is also not proof. So you close the brittle folder and feel the weight of what a missing page can do. It can destroy certainty, or it can invent a story you cannot forget. What would change your mind if a single folio contained an unmistakable pattern that no ordinary method could explain? Wilhelm Reich. You stand outside a low brick building, and the wind carries the ash taste of a fire. He began as a brilliant psychoanalyst and later claimed to have found a form of life energy he called orgone. His early books changed how therapists thought about character and the body. Those are the grounded facts. Then he moved from clinical practice into devices and weather plates and accumulators. He believed the accumulators concentrated a living force. Scientists tested his claims and found the evidence lacking. Medical organizations and researchers criticized his methods and the reproducibility of his results. That criticism followed the normal path of scientific scrutiny. What changed the story was the intervention of a government agency. The Food and Drug Administration investigated, and a federal court issued an injunction prohibiting interstate shipments of his devices and certain books. Court records show the steps taken and the orders given. Those are official documents, not rumor. In 1956 and 1957, a sequence of actions produced a different kind of record. Orders to destroy apparatus and copies of his books appear in archived files. Reporters and historians later documented the burning of materials under supervision. That destruction is an extraordinary fact. It is also the moment when the ordinary practice of regulation becomes a trigger for myth. People who distrust institutions read the burnings as proof of suppression. They take the absence of materials as a sign something threatening was erased. Historians answer that illegal or ineffective claims often attract legal response, and sometimes harsh remedies. The gap remains. A pile of burned books cannot be read. An empty shelf speaks louder than a filled one. So you imagine a single sheaf rescued from the flames and tucked in a pocket by a sympathetic clerk. Would that single sheaf be proof of a hidden reality or just a misread note in desperation? Your answer will tell you how to read every destroyed archive that follows. You hold a single rescued page between gloved fingers. The paper is browned at the edge, and a thumbprint smudged a line of handwriting. Witnesses later swore someone pulled a few sheets from a box before the fire. Those are claims recorded in interviews. They are not the same as finding the full archive. Court documents show the injunction and the chain of custody that followed. The Food and Drug Administration filed its orders. The judge signed an order. The destruction took place under supervision. Those are facts in public records. They are not opinion. Supporters of the scientist point to a stack of testimony about miraculous cures and weather experiments. They point to letters that claim success and to small experimental notebooks. Critics answer the same way science always answers. They ask for repeatable data, for controls, and for peer review. The debate is classic. It is also bitter. What turns that bitter debate into myth is the image of the burning. A pile of books incinerated under court order is a powerful symbol. It is easier to imagine suppression than to accept that a claim failed rigorous testing. Humans prefer drama when faced with equivocal records. Now, think of that smudged page. On it, a crude sketch leans into a few short words about energy and a single diagram of concentric lines. A scientist might read those marks as a speculative idea that failed experimental test. A believer might treat the same marks as a cipher left behind. Which reading do you choose when all you have is a charred margin and a memory of smoke? John Titor. You are awake at 2 a.m., scrolling a forum that smells of late-night coffee and anonymous courage. The posts begin in November 2000, and they claim to come from a soldier in the year 2036. He wrote technical jargon and a mission to retrieve an old IBM 5100 computer. The detail about the IBM 5100 surprised people because the machine could emulate legacy systems in a way few knew. That accuracy gave the posts traction. He described a device in a 1967 Chevrolet powered by micro-singularities, and he explained gravity distortion in ways that sounded like fictional physics and like sloppy popular science at once. Then there are predictions. He said civil unrest would begin in 2004 and that a major conflict would erupt in 2015. Those things did not happen. That failure is a major strike against a literal reading of his claims. Researchers who dug into timestamps and posting patterns found human signatures and possible coordination suggesting an elaborate hoax. Media historians call it early internet alternate reality storytelling. Enthusiasts answer with a different story. They point to the IBM 5100 detail and to a handful of obscure technical notes that matched real hardware quirks. What turns the tale into a mystery is not the posts alone. It is the sudden disappearance of the poster into anonymity and the fading of original archives. Some early mirrors vanished. Some archives later included gaps where the earliest threads once stood. A single printout, saved by a user before it disappeared, is the kind of object that fuels legend. Imagine holding that printout now. The ink is faded. It contains technical diagrams and a travel log. If you trusted it, what would you change about your view of time travel or simulation? If you distrust it, what does that disappearance tell you about how myths travel in the digital age? You study the saved screenshot, and the font looks ordinary, like any forum post at midnight. Someone printed the thread and kept the sheet. That printout is the single physical thing that made believers hold their ground when the threads began to vanish from mirrors and archives. Investigators measured posting times and server logs and found human patterns. The language analysis showed consistent vocabulary and repeated constructions. Those findings point to a single author or a coordinated team. That is a strong argument for fiction or for performance art. The IBM 5100 detail is tricky. That machine did have unusual emulation abilities that were obscure at the time. Some take that as proof of insider knowledge. Others say the detail was researchable, and that a clever writer could find it and use it as an authenticity trick. Both readings are plausible. Then there are the predictions that failed. If someone truly came from the future, why get those facts wrong? Believers answer with parallel timelines and multiverse branching. Skeptics answer with the simpler explanation that predictions were narrative choices or misinterpretations. The hardest fact is disappearance. Early mirrors of the posts disappeared or were edited. Some users say their saved files later showed gaps. A few claim to have kept a printout that later went missing or was corrupted. That missing printout is a powerful object. It is both evidence and myth seed. So which matters more to you, the unlikely technical detail or the failed predictions and missing archives? The answer will shape whether you see a clever hoax, a social experiment, or a footprint of something stranger that slipped through the net and then disappeared. Sergei Korolev. You walk into a dim hangar, and the echo of steel and motor oil fills your ears. He worked behind closed doors, the man who built rockets for a state that kept his name secret for years. In public, he was simply design chief. In private, he was the architect of launches that changed what humans could do. Here are the facts. He directed early Soviet space efforts. Under his leadership, satellites and human flights left the atmosphere. His identity was classified as a matter of national security for decades. That secrecy is documented in declassified archives and in memoirs of engineers who later spoke on the record. In 1966, he underwent surgery and complications followed. He died in hospital. The official notes list medical causes, and the Soviet record keeps the rest tight. Friends and colleagues later said that stress and long hours harmed his health. Historians point to medical records and contemporary testimony to support that account. What makes his story a magnet for rumor is the cloud of secrecy. Files stamped "Secret Create Space" for alternative readings. Engineers reported unexplained telemetry anomalies in early test flights. Those glitches have routine technical explanations like instrument error or radio interference. Yet, when files are sealed and the lead designer disappears from public view, speculation grows wild. Imagine a sealed reel of telemetry tape labeled with a launch date and a single line redacted. Imagine a notebook marked top secret and a clerk who says it was never cataloged. Those are small things. They are also exact kinds of things people turn into proof when they want to believe in hidden systems. So you are left with the choice. Do you accept the plain archive and the careful histories, or do you hold the redacted line and imagine it reads like code? Which story do you prefer to carry with you tonight? You imagine standing by a rack of metal reels, each one labeled with launch names you almost know. Engineers recall late nights, listening to hiss and static while they checked readings. Those personal memories are part of the record now. They tell a human story behind the launches. The hard facts are simple. He directed design efforts that launched satellites and sent humans into orbit. The Soviet state kept many records secret for national security. That secrecy is documented in declassified files and in memoirs that only appeared later when archives opened. Secrecy created space for stories. When telemetry showed odd blips early in tests, engineers logged them as sensor noise or radio interference. Those are ordinary technical explanations. They are often enough to explain what looks like a glitch to a listener in a hangar. But when files are stamped secret and key names are withheld from press, a different narrative emerges. Redacted lines in a report are fertile soil for conjecture. A single reel of telemetry labeled launch and then marked redacted becomes a symbol. People build meanings around that symbol. A retired technician once told a reporter about a reel he saw tucked into a locker and then removed by a man in plain clothes. The technician's name appears in interviews. The claim is testable if the reel is found. It is not proof until someone produces it and experts analyze it. So you hold that image of a reel in your mind. Is it a lost technical record, or is it a missing clue to something larger? The answer matters because it shows how gaps shape belief. The reel. Redacted lines and vanished entries are simple things that make a story feel like an unsolved code. Wilhelm Koenig. You crouch in a dim storeroom and lift a small clay jar crusted with salt and age. Inside sits a copper cylinder and an iron rod. The object looks ordinary and oddly modern at once. The jar turned up during excavations in Mesopotamia in the 1930s and came into a museum catalog. Koenig, an archaeologist and curator, recorded it among other finds. The basic facts are simple. The piece exists. It was documented. Photographs and museum records record its presence. What made it famous was an interpretation some researchers offered decades later. They suggested the jar might have functioned as an electrochemical cell, call it a battery, and the imagination quickens. If ancient people made a simple battery, then we ask what they used it for and how advanced their material practices were. Archaeologists caution strongly. They point out that similar jars may have held scrolls, fragrances, or ritual materials. The copper and iron could be parts of a non-functional assemblage, or the result of later intrusion. Laboratory tests are inconclusive or limited. Context matters more than poetic reading of objects. Enthusiasts counter that even a simple galvanic setup would count as technological knowledge that does not fit the standard timeline. They point to corrosion patterns and to matching fragments. Critics respond that corrosion can lie and that guessing function from form is dangerous. The real hinge in this story is not the jar alone. It is the documentation. Some early notes about the find are terse, and a few catalog entries are ambiguous. Imagine a single field notebook page with a sketch and a terse line that reads something like "experiment record," and then nothing more. That lost page would change how the jar is read. Would it be proof or a new set of questions? You hold the jar shard up to the light, and the glaze catches a green whisper of corrosion. A few laboratories attempted to test similar finds. They measured acidity and metal residues. They tried to recreate a simple galvanic cell. Results were mixed and often inconclusive. Archaeologists point out a simple truth. Context is everything. A jar in a grave or a jar in a workshop mean different things. Soil chemistry can move metals. Corrosion can mimic electrode behavior without any human intent to build a battery. Those are not dramatic statements. They are careful science. Enthusiasts built replicas and produced small voltages. That is interesting. It is also unsurprising. A copper rod, an iron core, and an acidic liquid will generate a potential. It does not prove a lost industrial practice or a hidden technology. It does show that with a little curiosity, you can make ancient materials do modern things. What would change this debate is a single primary note. Imagine a field notebook in which the finder wrote purpose, use, and a sketch with measurements. Imagine a line that reads used to gild or used to electroplate. That line would be a hinge between speculation and history. No such definitive page has surfaced. What exists are catalog entries, photographs, and contested readings. The jar remains an object that invites questions. You close your hands around the shard and feel its weight. A small thing sits between measured doubt and the pleasure of imagining a lost technique. Which will you trust when records are scarce and the imagination is loud? Eugene Malov. You step into a cluttered study, papers piled high, a coffee cup cold on a stack of printouts. He was a scientist turned journalist who believed that cold fusion experiments deserved another look. He wrote books, he pushed for replication, and he founded a small institute to pursue data that many in the mainstream had dismissed. The immediate facts are plain. After the famous claims in 1989 that two chemists reported excess heat, much of the field became controversial. Malov argued experiments were unfairly rejected and that replication attempts were worthwhile. He spoke loudly about suppressed results and missing data that he believed could change energy research. Then, tragedy struck. In 2004, he was killed in his home. The police investigated and legal processes followed. That much is documented and public. His death shocked colleagues and fans who had argued for his scientific cause. How does this move from tragedy to simulation lore? It is the missing material that matters. Malov claimed he had files and notes that mainstream journals ignored. After his death, some of those materials were shared, some remained private, and some details became fuzzy in interviews. When a researcher claims suppression and then is killed, the pattern looks dangerous. Scientists warn against leaping from correlation to conspiracy. They remind people that failed experiments and strong claims do not prove a hidden truth. Journalists and hobbyists point to disappeared emails and to promises of data that never fully appeared. Imagine a hard drive with a folder labeled Cold Fusion Data tucked into a safe and then made unavailable. Would that change your view if it were real? Or would you want independent verification above all? After the funeral, the Institute closed for a week and machines hummed in an empty lab. Colleagues packed boxes. Some materials went to colleagues. Some went to archives. People who knew him say he left behind data and promises of experiments that had not reached a final paper. Here is what scientists emphasize. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary verification. Cold fusion claims have long suffered from poor reproducibility and variable conditions. That is not a rhetorical point. It is the methodological backbone of experimental science. Results must be reproduced by independent teams with transparent methods. Supporters say Malova pushed transparency, and that some labs did find anomalies that were never fully explained. That gap between anomaly and consensus is where interest survives. It is also where suspicion about suppression grows when data are missing or inaccessible. Journalists investigated and found some materials online, and other materials withheld by private hands. Interviews mention a hard drive with raw experimental logs and a set of emails that were never publicly released. Some users claim to have backups. Others report corrupted files or partial archives. The pattern is messy and modern. Imagine that hard drive. It is encrypted or corrupted or simply not shared. If it contained clear, repeatable datasets, you would see peer-reviewed papers and attempts at replication by many teams. If it contains notes and noisy logs, it fuels rumor and hope. So the real question is method again. Would a single hard drive change the scientific picture if it had complete, reproducible data? Or would it only feed a story that comforts those who prefer suspicion over slow, careful replication? The answer matters because it tells you whether absence is proof or an invitation to test. Alexander Litvinenko. You sit by a hospital bed, and the air tastes clinical and faintly electric. He fell ill suddenly in London, and then died after a short, dramatic illness in 2006. Medical reports identified an unusual and rare radioactive isotope as the cause. Here are the facts that matter. Forensics confirmed poisoning with polonium-210. British authorities conducted a public inquiry. The inquiry concluded that the killing was likely state-related. Those conclusions are part of the public record. What makes this case relevant to our theme is the way a scientific substance became both weapon and evidence. Polonium is a material that needs technical knowledge and access. When such materials are involved, the chain of custody of samples and reports becomes crucial. People watch custody like a spy watches a file. Investigators publish sequences of who met whom and when. They showed traces of contamination in hotels and flights. At the same time, some records were redacted or kept confidential for security reasons. That combination of clear forensic detail and classified gaps is an engine for suspicion. Skeptics warn against leaping from evidence of political violence to claims that science reveals hidden realities. Legal processes and diplomatic channels explain many withheld details as matters of national security. Conspiracy readers see those same gaps as proof that someone wanted the full picture buried. Imagine a chain of custody form with one line blacked out and a missing signature. Imagine an autopsy report that quotes a lab, but then notes a file transferred under seal. Those small administrative blanks are the objects that feed stories. If that form were found unredacted, would your questions end or only deepen? Alexander Litvinenko. You watch a film of him arriving at a London hospital, pale and shaking, and you feel how sudden the collapse was. Doctors ran tests, and the results were unmistakable. Forensics found traces of a rare radioactive substance on his clothing and inside his tissues. The isotope, polonium-210, is not something you pick up in a supermarket. British investigators followed evidence across hotels and flights. They traced contamination to specific locations and people. A long public inquiry recorded interviews and reached conclusions that pointed toward state involvement. Those are the documented findings on record. At the same time, some documents were withheld for national security. Intelligence agencies and diplomats cited confidentiality. That created an obvious tension between transparency and safety. When files are sealed, a new narrative fills the silence. Journalists published leaked fragments, and commentators offered rival explanations. Some focused on geopolitics and motive. Others lingered on the technical side and asked how polonium-210 was obtained and handled. Experts explained that using such a substance requires specialized knowledge and access. That scientific detail is why the case crossed from crime into statecraft. The key hinge for speculation is not the science. It is the missing administrative trace. Imagine a chain of custody form with one line blacked out and a transferred sample noted as handled by a department name that is redacted. That small administrative gap becomes a symbol. If that form were found unredacted, would your answers change? Or would the reveal open a larger set of questions about how scientific materials move through secret channels? The form sits now in the public imagination as both evidence and question.